She locked the cafeteria doors and starved 300 kids over one missing tray until my best friend collapsed on the kitchen floor. So I made every parent in town show up at once. The chain went through both door handles twice. Principal Blade locked it with a padlock the size of my fist. A single sheet of paper hung taped below the glass, closed until further notice. Food waste and disrespect. That was the whole explanation. No names, no hearing. 300 kids stood in the hallway at 7:40 in the morning, holding lunch bags we wouldn't need for 8 hours, staring at a padlock like it owed us something. Somebody near the front tried the door handle anyway, like the chain might have loosened overnight. It hadn't. A junior named Owen Webb knocked on the glass, more out of disbelief than any real hope somebody would answer. Ms. Patel, the school nurse, stood a few feet back with her arms crossed, watching the whole scene with an expression I'd remember later. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to dread, like she already knew where this was headed before the rest of us did. A few teachers tried to explain it away as they passed through the hallway toward their classrooms. Mr. Iverson told a cluster of sophomores it was probably a one-day thing, an inventory issue, nothing to worry about. He didn't sound convinced of it himself. I checked the clock above the trophy case. 7:42. Lunch wasn't until 12:20, 5 hours away, and none of us yet understood that this particular Monday wouldn't end at 12:20 at all, that it would stretch into a version of this hallway we'd be standing in, one way or another, for the better part of 2 weeks. The intercom crackled during first period. Principal Blade's voice came through thick with something that sounded almost like relief. The cafeteria will remain closed until the individual responsible comes forward and accepts consequences. Nobody knew what they were supposed to come forward about. A tray had gone missing from the kitchen sometime Friday. That was the rumor anyway. One aluminum steam table pan, maybe $40, maybe less. Nobody had seen who took it. Nobody had even noticed it was gone until Blade did a Friday afternoon inventory walk and found the rack short by one. By lunch, kids were trading rumors in the hallway like currency. Somebody said a senior took it as a prank. Somebody said it fell behind the dish pit, and nobody looked hard enough. My best friend Tyler stood next to me at his locker, working his jaw the way he does when his blood sugar starts dipping, and he's trying not to show it. I have granola bars in my backpack, he said. If she finds them, does she suspend me for smuggling? I didn't laugh. Tyler's been type 1 diabetic since he was 9. He doesn't get to skip meals as a character-building exercise. He gets to skip meals and end up on a kitchen floor, which is exactly where this story was headed, though neither of us knew it yet. They'll open it back up by tomorrow, I told him. She's not actually going to starve 300 kids over a $40 tray. I was wrong about that. I want to be honest about how wrong I was, because it matters later. I underestimated her completely, and so did everyone else, right up until the moment we couldn't afford to anymore. My name is Nora Callahan. I was 16 that October, a junior at Ridgefield High School in Millbrook, Ohio, and I had no idea I was about to spend 2 weeks organizing a small war against a woman who ran our school like it belonged to her personally. This is the story of how that war started, how it almost cost my best friend his life, and how 100 parents with fast food bags did more to hold a principal accountable than any policy in that building ever could. Principal Diane Blade had been at Ridgefield for 2 years by then. She came to us from a school in Columbus, hired the summer after our old principal Gerald Voss got quietly pushed out over a grade-changing scandal involving 3 football players and a booster club with too much money. The district wanted someone who wouldn't bend for anybody. They wanted structure. They wanted a name people would respect on paper. Blade gave them exactly that. 52 years old, silver hair cut sharp at the jaw, the kind of posture that made hallway conversations stop when she walked past. Her first assembly, she told us the building had gotten soft under the old regime, and she intended to fix that. Some teachers loved her for it. The ones who'd been begging for tighter discipline for years finally felt heard. For a while, honestly, some of it worked. Hallway fights dropped. Vandalism dropped. She showed up early, stayed late, knew half our names by October of her first year. There's a story that made the rounds that fall. A freshman named Devin Carr had racked up $38 in unpaid lunch debt, the kind of debt that gets a kid's tray taken away in some districts, food dumped right in front of everyone in the lunch line. Blade heard about it from the cafeteria manager, walked down herself and paid it off out of her own purse without telling Devin who did it. The cafeteria staff told a few teachers. The teachers told us. For about a semester, that was the story people told about Principal Blade, not the chain on the door, the lunch debt. I bring that up because it matters. She wasn't cartoonish. She wasn't some mustache-twirling villain who woke up hoping to hurt kids. She believed in rules the way some people believe in weather, as something that existed to be obeyed, not questioned, and definitely not negotiated with by 16-year-olds. Somewhere between paying off Devin Carr's lunch account and chaining the cafeteria doors, something in her calcified. I don't fully understand what. I've had 2 years to think about it, and the closest I've come is this. She needed the building to reflect well on her, more than she needed it to actually work for the kids inside it. There was a dress code crackdown too, the spring of her first year, that still gets brought up at pep rallies as a cautionary joke. She sent 43 students home in a single week for code violations that had gone unenforced for years, a strap width here, a hem length there, costing some families actual money in replacement clothes on short notice. One single mother told the PTA she'd had to spend $60 she didn't have on new jeans with 2 days' notice. Blade framed it in an email that read almost identically to the one she'd send 18 months later about the cafeteria. As a matter of restoring standards the building had let slip. Parents complained. The crackdown quietly eased after about 3 weeks, not because Blade admitted anything, but because enforcement apparently cost more attention than she was willing to spend on jeans once the initial statement had already been made. I think about that quiet retreat now and wonder if it should have told us more than it did, that Blade cared less about outcomes than about the initial show of control. There was an earlier version of this exact fight, back when Harper and I were freshmen, though none of us clocked it as a preview at the time. Someone had spilled an entire carton of milk in the cafeteria and walked away without cleaning it up. A teacher's aide slipped in it. Nothing serious, a bruised elbow, but Blade lost it. She held the entire freshman class after school for 2 hours. 210 kids, crammed into the gym, writing reflection essays on personal accountability, until somebody finally stood up and admitted it was them. A kid named Priya Nasser, mortified, in tears, over spilled milk. Blade let everyone else go the second Priya confessed, like she'd proven a point. I remember Priya's voice cracking as she stood up in that packed gym, 200 kids staring at her over one spilled carton of milk. Blade didn't comfort her. She thanked her publicly for demonstrating exactly the kind of accountability the rest of the freshman class should aspire to, then dismissed everyone else without another word to Priya at all. Priya changed lunch tables for the rest of that year. I don't think anyone ever told Blade that part. Collective punishment until somebody broke. That was always the pattern. We just didn't know yet how far she'd take it when the stakes were actual food instead of an afternoon detention. Harper Reyes sat 2 seats behind me in AP Government that year, and if you'd asked me back then to guess who would end up leading a small-scale rebellion against our principal, I would not have said Harper. She'd never gotten so much as a tardy slip. But Harper's mother, Elena Reyes, was an employment attorney downtown, and Harper's grandmother, Constance Reyes, had sat on the Millbrook Unified School District Board of Education for 20 years. Harper grew up at kitchen tables where adults argued about bylaws and due process the way other families argued about football. She knew, better than any of us, exactly which rules a principal could bend, and exactly which ones she couldn't. My own house sat 4 blocks from Ridgefield, close enough that I'd walked to school since middle school, with the same scuffed backpack looped over one shoulder. My dad worked as an electrician for a contracting company out of the county seat, home most nights by 6. Not much for school gossip, but always willing to listen if I brought it to him at dinner. My mom worked for the district itself, which meant I grew up hearing about boiler repairs and roof leaks and budget line items the way other kids heard about their parents' office politics. I didn't think much of it at 16. It would matter more than I could have guessed later that same October. Ridgefield wasn't a big school by Ohio standards, just under 900 students across 4 grades, small enough that everybody at least recognized everybody else's face even if they didn't know the name attached to it. Millbrook was the kind of town where the football schedule ran in the local paper and the school board meetings, usually half-empty affairs in a beige conference room at the district office, occasionally made the front page when something actually went wrong. Before that October, nothing at Ridgefield had gone wrong enough to make that front page in years. Blade's reputation among parents split roughly down a predictable line. The ones who liked order for its own sake thought she was exactly what the building needed after Gerald Voss. The ones who paid closer attention noticed something else. How often her discipline landed hardest on kids who couldn't easily push back. How her praise in the hallway always seemed to circle back to how a well-run building reflected on her personally, rather than on the kids inside it. I hadn't paid close enough attention to notice that pattern myself, not until the week the doors got chained forced me to look at 2 years of her tenure all at once, instead of one incident at a time. Tyler and I had been best friends since 4th grade, back when his diagnosis was still new enough that he carried a laminated card in his backpack, explaining what to do if he passed out. By 16, he managed it well. Insulin pump, continuous glucose monitor clipped to his arm, snacks stashed everywhere out of habit more than fear. But managing a chronic illness requires something as basic and non-negotiable as regular food, and Blade had just removed that from 300 kids' school day over a $40 tray and a bruised ego. I didn't know any of that would collide the way it did. I just knew, standing at Tyler's locker that Monday morning, that something about the chain on the door felt different from anything Blade had done before. Usually, her overreach hit one kid, one class, one afternoon. This time, she'd locked the door on all of us at once, and something about the scale of it made my stomach feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with skipping breakfast. By Tuesday, the tightness had a reason. The football team ran conditioning drills that morning, and 3 players had to sit out, dizzy, hands shaking against their knees. The swim team's 5 a.m. practice ended with 2 girls throwing up in the locker room. Nothing left in their stomachs to throw up but bile. Kids started keeping granola bars and crackers zipped into jacket sleeves, passing them hand to hand in the hallway like contraband. Blade caught on by lunch. She sent an email to every teacher in the building, copied to the assistant principal, Mr. Dunmore, who I don't think agreed with any of it but also didn't have the spine to say so out loud. Confiscate any food observed being consumed or distributed outside designated hours. Log the student's name. Repeated violations may result in disciplinary action reflected on the student's permanent record. By 5th period, Mr. Grady in AP Chemistry caught a sophomore named Ben Ostrander eating a granola bar at his lab table and confiscated it without a word, dropped it straight into the trash can at the front of the room while 25 kids watched. Ben didn't argue. He just sat there red-faced for the rest of the period, the way you do when an adult humiliates you over something something that shouldn't be humiliating at all. Somebody filmed 12 seconds of it before a teacher's aide told them to put their phone away. That clip made it around the school by the end of the day, not because it was shocking exactly, but because it was so plainly, deliberately small. An adult with a college degree throwing away a granola bar to prove a point to a room full of teenagers. The swim coach, Ms. Halloran, quietly told her team to eat before practice at home if they could manage it. Off the record, a small act of defiance dressed up as basic coaching advice. She never said Blade's name out loud when she said it. She didn't have to. That was the first ceiling. Kids adapting, hiding food, being reasonable about it, quietly finding workarounds instead of causing a scene. And Blade's answer wasn't to reopen the cafeteria. It was to threaten transcripts. 16-year-olds start caring a lot about permanent records once college applications are a year away, and Blade knew that better than we did. She wasn't just withholding food. She was making it cost something specific and lasting to eat. Tyler had to leave class 3 times that day to check his blood sugar with the nurse, Ms. Patel, who kept glucose tablets in a locked cabinet and looked, every single time Tyler walked in, like she wanted to march down the hall and unlock that cafeteria herself. Her hands were tied by the same chain of command that had tied everyone else's. She wasn't allowed to override a principal's building-wide directive, not without going through channels that would take longer than Tyler's blood sugar could wait. "I hate this," he told me at his locker after school, voice flat in the way his voice gets when he's actually scared and doesn't want it to show. It's not even about the tray anymore. Nobody even remembers the tray. He was right. By Tuesday afternoon, the tray had stopped being the point. The point had become whether Blade would back down, and she'd built her entire 2 years at Ridgefield around never doing that. Wednesday was the second ceiling, and it broke fast. A junior named Grace Delgado collapsed in 4th period chemistry, straight down out of her chair onto the tile. No warning. The kind of fall that makes a sound you don't forget. Mr. Iverson, her teacher, caught her shoulder on the way down and kept her head off the floor by maybe 2 inches. I heard about it before the period even ended. The way news like that moves through a school, kid to kid, faster than any PA announcement. Grace was fine. Dehydrated, low blood sugar from 2 days of restricted eating, nothing an IV bag in the nurse's office and a granola bar couldn't fix. But Mr. Iverson filed an incident report that afternoon, and by evening, half the parents in Millbrook had heard about it. The school's main line rang all day Wednesday. I know because Harper's mom called it herself twice and got the same recorded voicemail message both times. Word of Grace's collapse moved through the building differently than the granola bar video had. Kids who barely knew her stopped by the nurse's office that afternoon just to check, crowding the hallway until Ms. Patel came out and told everyone gently that Grace was resting and they should get back to class. Our counselor, Mrs. Ferreira, pulled 4 or 5 of us aside that afternoon, off the record, and asked carefully whether any of us were also feeling dizzy or lightheaded. Nobody wanted to admit it in front of a counselor who might have to report it somewhere. I lied and said I was fine. I wasn't entirely fine. I don't think anyone in that hallway was entirely fine. Grace's mother showed up at the front office within the hour and, from what I heard later, wasn't allowed past the front desk without a visitor badge. Standard procedure, the kind of small bureaucratic wall that must have felt unbearable with her daughter recovering 30 feet away behind a closed door. She left a voicemail on the district's main line that afternoon that a secretary later admitted, off the record, made her cry at her desk. Blade's response came at 6 that evening, a mass email to every household in the district. Subject line, a note on character. I still have it saved. She wrote about the importance of resilience, about how the real world doesn't hand you comfort on demand, about how respecting shared resources builds discipline that serves students long after graduation. She never mentioned Grace by name. She never mentioned the collapse at all. It read like she was solving a philosophy problem instead of explaining why a 16-year-old had hit a classroom floor. That's the kind of thing people mean when they use the word gaslighting, even though I didn't have that word ready in my head yet at 16. She wasn't denying what happened. She was reframing it into something noble, something we should thank her for, and doing it in writing, to every parent in town, less than 12 hours after a kid went down in front of a full classroom. Harper found me at my locker Thursday morning before first period, and I could tell by the set of her jaw she'd stopped being calm about any of it. They want to play games with rules, she said, so let's give them a game they can't win within their own rules. She'd spent Wednesday night on the phone with her mom, walking through the actual student handbook line by line. There was no policy against parents visiting campus during school hours. There was no policy requiring lunch to be pre-packed rather than delivered in person. There was, in fact, an explicit visitor policy that guaranteed any parent the right to sign in at the front office and remain on campus for a reasonable period, provided they didn't disrupt instruction. Nobody wrote a rule against feeding your own kid, Harper said, because nobody ever thought they'd need to. She pulled about 15 of us behind the gym after last bell and laid it out. Text your parents. Tell them to bring lunch in person, not pack it ahead of time. Tell them to come during the actual lunch period, sign in properly, follow every rule on the books, and tell them to stay as long as they wanted, because nothing in the handbook put a clock on a parent's visit. It wasn't a protest, not technically. It was 300 families using a loophole that had always existed because nobody in the history of the building had ever needed to weaponize kindness before. Thursday at 11:30, it started small. One mom walked through the front doors with 2 bags of fast food, signed the visitor log, and made her way to the commons where kids usually ate, then another, then 5 more within 10 minutes. By 11:45, the parking lot was full past capacity. Cars parked on the grass shoulder, one truck blocking the fire lane entirely. By noon, the front office had over 100 parents crowded into a space built for maybe 15, all filling out visitor badges, all polite, all completely unwilling to leave until their kid had eaten an actual meal. I watched it happen from the science hallway window with Tyler beside me, both of us pressed to the glass like little kids. His mom's car pulled in around 11:40, and when she walked through the front doors carrying 2 paper bags from the diner on Route 9, I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in 3 days. She found him in the commons, handed him a foil-wrapped sandwich and a bottle of orange juice, and sat with him at a cafeteria table like it was any ordinary Thursday, like there wasn't a padlock still hanging uselessly from the chained doors 20 feet away. Not every kid had a parent who could get away from work that fast. A junior named Aisha Bello sat 2 tables over with nobody, and Harper's mom, without being asked, walked over with an extra container of pasta salad she'd packed for herself and split it between 3 kids she'd never met before that morning. That was the part of Thursday nobody put in a group chat screenshot. Parents feeding kids who weren't theirs, quietly, because that was the actual point underneath the loophole Harper had found. The fire marshal showed up at 12:15, called in over the blocked fire lane, and stood in the middle of the commons shouting about occupancy limits while parents smiled at him and kept unpacking pizza boxes across the cafeteria tables like he was background noise. Blade's voice cracked over the intercom at 12:30, ordering all visitors to vacate the building immediately. Nobody moved. Not one parent packed up early. That was the third ceiling, and Blade's answer to it was the ugliest thing she'd done yet. She didn't back down, and she didn't negotiate. Instead, she directed Mr. Dunmore to start writing up students, not the parents who'd organized the visit, the students themselves, for disruption to the instructional environment, a vague enough charge that it could mean almost anything. 14 kids got written up that afternoon for the crime of having eaten lunch their own mother handed them. Tyler was one of them. I was another. It was a threat with a very specific shape. You can't punish parents for following the rules, but you can punish their kids for something adjacent enough to look official on paper, and that punishes the parents just as effectively, through the people they love most, weaponizing us against them, and using the record we all cared so much about as the leverage. It was the same move as the confiscation and transcript threat from Tuesday, just aimed at a bigger target. Mr. Dunmore delivered the write-ups himself that afternoon, pulling us out of class one at a time into the hallway, instead of summoning us to a waiting room full of other kids watching who'd been called in next. He didn't quite meet my eyes when he handed me the slip. "For the record," he said quietly, folding his hands behind his back, "I don't agree with this particular directive. It was the closest thing to dissent I saw from any adult in the building that whole week, and even then he still signed the paper and still put it in my file. A senior named Priya Whitfield, no relation to the freshman from 2 years earlier, just an unlucky coincidence of names in a small school," cried in the hallway after getting hers, worried out loud that a disciplinary note might complicate the early decision application she'd already submitted to Ohio State. Nobody could tell her for certain that it wouldn't. That uncertainty was its own kind of leverage, the same threat as the granola bar confiscation, just aimed further down the road, at futures instead of afternoons. Friday it got bigger anyway. Word had moved through every group chat in Millbrook overnight, parent chats and kid chats both, and by 11:30 that morning, there were closer to 300 parents on campus instead of 100. Constance Reyes, Harper's grandmother, 20 years on the school board, 71 years old, and built like she'd never lost an argument in her life, arrived with a full breadstick station on a folding table, set it up in the commons like she'd been catering events there for a decade, and started handing out warm bread to any kid who walked past. By 11:45, the commons looked less like a school cafeteria and more like a town potluck that had overrun its permit. A father in a Millbrook Fire Department t-shirt manned a cooler of sandwiches near the vending machines. 2 moms from the swim team traded casseroles like it was a holiday. Somebody's grandfather had brought a coffee urn the size of a fire hydrant and was pouring cups for any parent who looked like they'd been standing too long. Tyler sat with his mom at the same table as Thursday, working through a turkey sandwich slower than he needed to, like he wanted to make it last in case tomorrow the doors were locked again. I sat across from him, watching Constance Reyes hold court over her breadstick table like she'd been doing it her whole life, and for about 20 minutes it felt less like a standoff and more like the building had briefly remembered what it was actually for. Security approached her within 10 minutes and asked her to leave. "I'm on the school board, dear," she said, not even glancing up from the tray she was arranging. "I'll leave when these children have eaten." I watched Blade's face through the hallway window during that exchange. I'd never seen an adult look that close to combustion in real life. Her jaw worked, her hands stayed clenched at her sides, and for just a second before she turned and walked back toward her office, I thought she might actually lose it in front of the entire commons. She didn't. She went straight to her office instead and, we found out later, called Superintendent Marcusfeld directly, framing the entire day as a coordinated act of parental interference, orchestrated to undermine her authority, playing the victim to the one person above her who could actually end her career before anyone else got the chance to frame it differently. Tyler and I walked home together after the swim team's makeshift lunch wound down, the same 4 blocks we'd walked probably 1,000 times since elementary school. He seemed steadier that afternoon, color back in his face, the turkey sandwich and his mom's insulin adjustment doing what 5 days of hidden granola bars hadn't been able to do. We talked about nothing in particular, a chemistry test the following week, whether Constance Reyes would show up again Monday with an even bigger spread. Neither of us mentioned how close the week had come to actually hurting somebody. I think we both needed, for one afternoon, to pretend the worst part was already behind us. It wasn't. I didn't know that yet, walking those 4 blocks in the last ordinary light of that week. But some part of me, the part that kept replaying Grace Delgado's collapse 2 days after it happened, wasn't as convinced as I wanted to be. I should have known, watching Blade's face through that window, that we hadn't reached the real ceiling yet. That came 7 hours later, at Tyler's house. On a Friday night, none of us saw coming even after everything that week had already shown us. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Tyler's blood sugar had been unstable all week, spiking on the rare full meals he managed to get, crashing hard during the long stretches without food, the kind of whiplash a body isn't built to absorb over and over. Friday night, after a week of exactly that, his body stopped compensating. His mom found him on the kitchen floor a little after 8, unconscious, his glucose monitor alarm going off unheard in his bedroom where he'd left his phone charging. I got the story in pieces over the weekend, mostly from his mom, because Tyler himself didn't remember much past starting to feel dizzy near the fridge. Paramedics arrived in 9 minutes. He came to in the ambulance, confused, asking his mom what day it was. He spent 4 hours in the ER at Millbrook General getting stabilized, an IV drip correcting what a week of food insecurity had done to a body that depended on consistency to survive. His parents didn't wait until Monday to act. The second he was stable enough for them to leave his side, his mom called their family attorney, a woman named Naomi Fenn, who'd handled their homeowner's insurance for years and had exactly one relevant question when she heard the details. Had the school been formally notified in writing of Tyler's medical condition and dietary needs? It had. Every year since 6th grade, an updated 504 plan on file with the district, specifying his access to food as a documented medical accommodation. That weekend I barely slept. I kept replaying the sound Grace Delgado's collapse must have made, the sound I imagined Tyler's fall must have made too, even though I wasn't there for either one. I thought about the missing tray, the actual object that had started this, and how nobody in 5 straight days had ever mentioned what it looked like or where it went, or whether anyone had actually looked for it. It had stopped mattering to Blade almost the moment she chained the door. I don't think it was ever really about the tray at all, though it would take another week before I understood exactly what it had been about. My mom, Carol Callahan, worked in the district's facilities and maintenance department, 14 years by then, mostly handling work orders, broken boilers, leaking roofs, pest control, the unglamorous machinery that keeps a building running. Saturday afternoon, while I sat at our kitchen table trying and failing to do algebra homework, she was on the phone with a coworker, half paying attention to me, half working through some scheduling backlog on her laptop. I heard her go quiet mid-sentence. "Wait," she said into the phone. "We never closed that one out? The cafeteria one from the week before?" I didn't think much of it at the time. It was one sentence in the middle of a boring work call, the kind of thing adults say about spreadsheets all day long. I went back to my homework. I didn't know yet that I'd just heard the loose thread that would unravel the entire thing. Monday morning, my phone buzzed under my desk during second period math. A screenshot tore through every group chat in the school within about 4 minutes. A court filing, Tyler's name at the top, his parents listed as plaintiffs, Millbrook Unified School District named as defendant, negligence, failure to accommodate a documented medical condition. I read it 3 times before my hand stopped shaking enough to text Tyler back. I found him by his own locker before the bell even finished ringing, both of us reading the filing over each other's shoulders on his phone screen, because mine had already died from checking it too many times that morning. He didn't look angry, not exactly. He looked embarrassed, like being the named plaintiff in a lawsuit against his own school was somehow his fault, instead of something that had happened to him. "They didn't even ask me first," he said quietly, and I understood what he meant. His parents had made the call in an ER waiting room at 2 in the morning, and now his name was a matter of public record whether he was ready for that or not. The intercom clicked on before either of us had time to say much else. "Emergency assembly," Blade's voice announced. "Gym, immediately, all students and staff." We filed in and packed the bleachers in a silence I'd never heard in that gym before, not even during a moment of silence for anything. Blade stood at center court holding a microphone, and for the first time in 2 years, she didn't look like a woman who owned the room. She looked cornered, and cornered animals, I was about to learn, don't apologize. They pick a target. "Effective immediately," she said, forcing each word out like it cost her something physical. "The cafeteria will reopen." Half the gym exhaled at once. Somebody near the top row actually cheered. I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in 5 days. Then Blade raised one hand for silence, and her eyes moved slowly across the bleachers, scanning row by row like she was hunting a specific face in a crowd. I watched her find it. 3 rows down from me, Harper sat very still, and Blade's eyes locked on her the way a hawk locks onto something small and moving in a field. "There will also be a full disciplinary investigation into last Friday's demonstration," she said. "Harper Reyes is suspended, effective immediately, pending that review." The gym went dead silent, 300 kids not breathing at once. I turned and looked at Harper and watched every bit of color drain out of her face in real time. She hadn't broken a single rule. She'd followed every single one, precisely, deliberately, because that was the entire strategy. And Blade had just punished her for it in front of the whole school anyway, using a word like demonstration to make a peaceful, rule-following lunch delivery sound like an insurrection. Blade dismissed us back to class like she hadn't just declared open war on the one family in Millbrook, with both a lawyer and a school board member sitting at its kitchen table. I don't think she understood, in that moment, what she'd just done. I don't think she understood that Harper's suspension was about to matter far more than the tray, the lockdown, or even Tyler's collapse, because it was the thing that finally made my mother stop treating a strange work order as background noise on a Saturday phone call and start treating it as a question that needed an answer. Harper didn't cry in the gym. She waited until we were alone in the girls' bathroom outside the science wing, door propped, nobody else around, before her composure finally cracked. I followed every single rule, she said, voice shaking in a way I'd never heard from her before. I checked the handbook 4 times before I even texted anyone. She didn't finish the sentence. I don't think she had an ending for it yet. Tyler leaned against the sink counter, quieter than either of us, working through something I couldn't quite read on his face. This isn't your fault, he told her. None of this is your fault. You didn't do anything but feed people. Tell that to my suspension record, Harper said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely unsure whether the adults in charge of her future actually cared whether she'd done anything wrong at all. I didn't have anything useful to offer either of them in that bathroom. I just stood there, feeling the particular kind of helpless that comes from watching someone you care about get punished for being right. It wasn't until my mom picked me up 2 hours later, laptop already halfway out of her bag before we'd even left the parking lot, that the helpless feeling started to have something to actually attach itself to. My mom picked me up from school that afternoon and didn't say much on the drive home, which for her meant she was thinking hard about something. She waited until we were both at the kitchen table, dinner half made and forgotten on the stove, before she pulled her work laptop out of her bag. I want to check something, she said. It's probably nothing. It wasn't nothing. 20 minutes into the district's facilities database, cross-referenced against the public portal for the Millbrook County Health Department, she found the thread she'd half noticed on Saturday and pulled it all the way through. An emergency pest control service request had been logged for the Ridgefield Cafeteria kitchen, the Thursday before the doors were ever chained, 2 full days before anyone claimed a tray had gone missing. The request cited rodent activity near the dry storage shelving. It had never been formally closed out in the system, which was the strange gap that had caught my mom's attention on that Saturday call in the first place. She pulled the health department's public inspection log next. An unannounced walkthrough had happened that same week, and it had failed. 2 cited violations, evidence of rodent droppings within 12 inches of unsealed dry goods storage, and an expired inspection tag on the kitchen's fire suppression system, 6 weeks overdue for renewal. The citation carried a $650 fine and a mandatory follow-up inspection within 14 days, or the district would be required to formally shut the kitchen down under state code. And this was the part my mom underlined twice on the printout, the part that made her hand tighten around the pen, file a public report to the State Board of Education documenting the failure. There was one more piece, and it was the piece that made everything click into a shape I hadn't expected. My mom found an internal memo, forwarded through a district assistant's shared inbox 2 weeks earlier, confirming that Principal Blade's employment status was provisional, pending a permanent contract vote at the December school board meeting. A failed publicly documented health citation on her watch, mandatory report to the state, would have landed on the board's desk right as they considered whether to make her permanent. My mom printed everything twice, once for herself, and once, she said, in case somebody tries to tell us later that it didn't exist. We sat at that kitchen table until almost 11, working back through the timeline together on a legal pad, the Thursday pest control request, the failed walkthrough 2 days later, the Friday tray report that suddenly looked less like an isolated incident and more like a story somebody had reached for in a hurry once the real problem couldn't be quietly contained anymore. I called Harper before I called Tyler, mostly because I knew she'd understand the shape of what I was looking at faster than anyone else our age would. She was quiet on the phone for almost 30 seconds after I read her the citation numbers. A provisional contract, she finally said. That's the whole thing. That's why she couldn't just say there was a rodent problem. A rodent problem is a fixable embarrassment. A rodent problem plus a hidden citation right before her contract vote is a fireable one. Tyler took it differently when I called him next. He went quiet for longer than Harper had, and when he finally spoke, his voice had an edge to it I'd never heard from him before, not even the night after his own collapse. She let people think it was about a tray, he said. She let me think it was about a tray. I spent 4 days blaming a missing steam pan for almost passing out on my kitchen floor. None of us slept much that night. My mom stayed up even later than I did, cross-referencing the memo's timestamp against the board's public meeting calendar, confirming the December vote date twice before she finally closed the laptop. It's real, she told me, somewhere close to midnight. It's all real, and it's all provable. That's the part that matters now. The missing tray was real. I want to be fair about that, because a completely invented story would have been easier to disprove, and Blade wasn't sloppy enough for that. Somebody probably had walked off with a $40 steam table pan sometime that Friday, but it had never been the reason listen for anything. It was a convenient, sympathetic-sounding excuse, food waste and disrespect, character and resilience, draped over the real problem, which was rodents near the dry storage and an expired fire tag that would have ended her career if it went public on schedule. Chaining the doors under the banner of discipline bought her exactly what she needed: time. Time to quietly handle the pest problem, get the tag renewed, and pass the follow-up inspection before anyone outside the building connected the dots, all while every kid and parent in Millbrook believed we were fighting about a tray. I sat at that kitchen table a long time after my mom finished explaining it, feeling something shift underneath everything I thought I understood about that week. Grace Delgado hadn't collapsed over a tray. Tyler hadn't ended up on his kitchen floor over a tray. Harper hadn't gotten suspended over a tray. All of it had happened because a woman with a provisional contract needed 2 weeks of cover, and 300 kids' lunches were the cheapest, quietest cover available to her. What do we do with this? I asked my mom, and I remember her looking at the printouts for a long moment before she answered. We do it in public, she said, and we do it somewhere she can't control the room. That somewhere turned out to already be scheduled. The board had moved up an emergency session for that Wednesday, officially to address recent disruptions and disciplinary matters. A session called, ironically, to formally review Harper's suspension and discuss the district's exposure from Tyler's lawsuit. Blade had unknowingly built us the exact room my mom wanted. The district office conference room held maybe 150 people comfortably. Close to 300 showed up that Wednesday night, spilling into the hallway, parents standing along the back wall, a local news crew from Millbrook's evening station set up near the door because Tyler's lawsuit had already made it onto their radar over the weekend. Constance Reyes sat at the board table itself, required to recuse herself from any vote involving her own granddaughter, but very much present, very much watching. I sat between my mom and Harper in the third row, the printouts folded into a manila envelope in my lap, my knee bouncing hard enough that Harper finally put a hand on it just to make it stop. Grace Delgado's mother spoke forth, describing watching the school nurse's number pop up on her phone at 10:40 in the morning and the specific kind of fear that comes with not yet knowing how bad it is. Tyler's mother spoke sixth, steady, and precise, laying out the 504 plan timeline in a voice that clearly came from someone who'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror more than once, determined not to let it shake in front of the board. Public comment came before the disciplinary review, 3 minutes per speaker. I signed up the second the sheet went around, hands sweating around the pen, and I sat through 6 other parents speaking about hunger and fear and blood sugar crashes before my name got called. By then, the room had already been primed with an hour of parents describing exactly what that week had cost their kids, in symptoms and in fear, in a way that made the missing tray sound almost laughably small by comparison. Nobody in that room was expecting the story to have a second layer underneath it. They thought they already knew the worst part. I stood up holding my mom's printouts, and my voice shook for the first sentence, and then it stopped shaking because I looked at Blade sitting at the front of the room and something about her expression, composed, waiting, already halfway to board, like she expected this to be more of the same emotional appeals she'd been fielding for 2 weeks, made me angry enough to steady myself. This was never about a tray, I said. On October the 2nd, an emergency pest control request was filed for our cafeteria kitchen. 2 days later, an unannounced health inspection failed. Rodent droppings near dry storage. An expired fire suppression tag, 6 weeks overdue. The citation required a follow-up inspection within 14 days, or the district would have to file a public report to the State Board of Education. I held the printout up, hands steadier than I expected. That report would have landed 2 weeks before Principal Blade's contract vote in December. The cafeteria wasn't locked because of a missing tray. It was locked so nobody would ask why the health department had already been in that kitchen. The room didn't stay quiet the way it had in the gym. It erupted. Parents talking over each other, a board member banging a gavel that nobody respected for a full 10 seconds, the news camera swinging hard toward the front table. Blade's composure cracked in real time, right there in front of everyone, in a way I hadn't seen even during the standoff with Harper's grandmother. That is an unrelated administrative matter, she said, voice tight, reaching for the same reframing tone from her note on character email. It has no bearing on tonight's discussion regarding student discipline. It has every bearing, I said. You suspended Harper for following your own rules perfectly. You did that 2 hours after finding out my mom had pulled the pest control record. You needed a distraction, and you used a 16-year-old to build one. That was the moment somebody else stood up near the back of the room, and I turned to see Rosa Okafor, the cafeteria's head cook, 11 years at Ridgefield, hands twisting the strap of her purse like she was fighting her own nerves to get the words out. I can confirm the pest control call, she said. I made it myself the Thursday before. I was told by administration not to discuss it with staff or families. I was told it would be handled quietly, and I didn't have a good enough reason not to trust that. Her voice caught, then steadied. I have 300 kids I feed every day. I should have said something sooner. I'm saying it now. A murmur ran through the room while Rosa spoke, parents turning to look at each other like they were all confirming, silently, that they'd heard the same thing. Superintendent Feld, who'd been sitting rigid at the end of the board table all evening, pulled out a legal pad and started writing without looking up again. Another kitchen staff member, a woman named Denise Okoro I recognized from the lunch line but had never spoken to directly, half rose from her seat in the audience like she might add something too, then sat back down. One corroboration apparently enough for the room to believe the rest without her having to risk her own job job on top of Rosa's. I watched Blade's face in that moment, and it wasn't fury anymore. It was something closer to recognition. The recognition of someone watching every carefully built cover story collapse in real time, in front of a camera, in front of a board that controlled whether she'd have a job in December. She didn't have another reframe ready. For the first time in 2 years, in front of 300 people who'd once believed every word she said, Diane Blade had absolutely nothing to say back. "I need you to understand something," I said, and this was the line I'd practiced in my head all afternoon. The one thing I needed her to hear in a room where she couldn't control what happened next. Kids collapsed. My best friend ended up on his kitchen floor. And the entire time, you knew exactly why the doors were really locked. You let us believe it was about us, about respect, about character, because the truth would have cost you your job. It should have cost you your job. It still should. Superintendent Feld, sitting 2 seats down from Blade, wouldn't meet her eyes for the rest of the meeting. The board voted that same night to place her on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation and to reverse Harper's suspension effective immediately, striking it from her record. It felt for about 10 minutes on the drive home like the whole thing was over. It wasn't, not really. Investigations don't move at the speed anger does. And the 2 weeks after that board meeting were messier than the 2 weeks before it, just messier in a quieter register. The district sent a families-wide email 2 days later, careful and lawyered, confirming that Principal Blade had been placed on administrative leave pending review of matters discussed at the November session, without naming a single specific fact from that session. Mr. Dunmore was named interim administrator, and if you'd told me 2 weeks earlier that I'd feel something like sympathy for him, I wouldn't have believed you. He reopened the cafeteria fully that week. No restrictions, no confiscation policy, no leftover rules from Blade's tenure, and stood in the doorway himself the first morning, watching 300 kids walk through like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, which it should have been the entire time. The district opened a formal inquiry into the health citation cover-up, which meant depositions, which meant my mom sat for 4 hours with a district attorney asking her to explain, on the record, exactly how she'd found the work order and why she'd gone looking. Her supervisor wasn't thrilled that she'd pulled records outside her normal scope, even though everything she'd found was accurate and everything she'd done was, strictly speaking, within her access rights. She got a formal write-up for improper escalation outside established reporting channels, which felt, to both of us, like an insult dressed up as procedure. It didn't cost her the job. It cost her 3 uncomfortable months of being the person some coworkers quietly avoided in the break room, the one who'd made things complicated for everybody by being right in public. The district's insurance carrier assigned an outside investigator to the case by early December, a retired administrator from a neighboring county named Walter Griggs, who spent 3 days at Ridgefield interviewing staff and pulling records the district hadn't fully centralized in years. His final report, 26 pages long, confirmed everything my mom's printouts had already shown and added one detail none of us had known. Blade had specifically instructed the kitchen staff, in a written memo dated the same day as the chained doors, to route all health department correspondence through her office directly, rather than the standard facilities channel. That single instruction, more than anything else in the file, was what the board's attorney later called in a closed session the clearest evidence of intent they'd found. Rosa Okafor faced something similar, worse in some ways because her job was less protected. A few staff loyal to Blade, and there were more of them than I expected, people who genuinely believed in the discipline-first philosophy and saw Rosa's public comment as a betrayal rather than honesty, froze her out for weeks, stopped including her in the small kitchen staff conversations that make an 11-hour shift bearable. The district's food service union stepped in when a supervisor tried to shift her hours in a way that read like retaliation, and by January she'd been promoted to kitchen manager instead, which felt like the correct ending even if it took longer and cost more than it should have. I stopped by the kitchen window in February after her promotion had already gone through, mostly just to tell her the pasta that day was good, which it was. She waved me over anyway, wiped her hands on her apron, and told me something I hadn't expected to hear. "I almost didn't stand up that night," she said. "I had 11 years built up in that kitchen. 11 years is a long time to risk on one meeting." She shrugged, the kind of shrug that carries more weight than the gesture usually does. "But I kept thinking about your friend on his kitchen floor. I fed that boy lunch nearly every school day for 2 years. I wasn't going to sit there and let her keep lying about why he ended up there. I think about that conversation more than almost anything else from that stretch. Rosa didn't have a lawyer mother or a school board grandmother behind her. She had 11 years of seniority she could have lost completely, and she stood up anyway, because somebody needed to, and she'd decided it might as well be her." Tyler's lawsuit settled out of court in November, before it ever reached a public trial. The terms weren't dramatic. His medical costs covered, a modest sum beyond that for what his family had gone through, but the settlement included something that mattered more to me than any dollar figure: a mandatory written policy, filed with the state, guaranteeing documented medical accommodations couldn't be suspended building-wide regardless of any disciplinary situation, ever again, for any reason. Tyler's name is on that policy, whether the paperwork says so or not. Harper came back from her reversed suspension quieter than before, which surprised me at first and then didn't. She'd built the entire plan around following every rule exactly, certain that would protect her, and it hadn't protected her at all. It took the board meeting, and my mom's records, and Rosa's courage to actually protect her. I think some of Harper's structure's certainty about rules, about fairness working the way it's supposed to if you just do everything correctly, didn't survive that October. We stayed close, but there was a version of Harper before that week who believed systems worked if you were careful enough inside them, and that version didn't come back. Not everyone in Millbrook sided with us either, and that surprised me more than it should have. A handful of parents at pickup lines and grocery stores called the whole thing an overreaction, said kids today can't handle a little structure, said Blade had been trying to teach a real lesson and got railroaded by a lawsuit-happy family and a board member's granddaughter with connections. My Aunt Denise said it plainest. Halfway through Thanksgiving dinner that year, Fork paused over her plate. Kids need to learn they can't win every fight by calling a lawyer, she said, not quite looking at me. That woman was trying to teach y'all something, and now she's probably going to lose her whole career over a lunch line. I didn't finish my plate. I told her as evenly as I could manage that a woman had let 300 kids go hungry, and one of them nearly died to protect a job she got to keep anyway, just in a different office, and that I didn't think that was a lesson worth what it cost. She didn't have much to say back to that. Neither of us brought it up again for the rest of the meal, though I noticed my mom reach over and squeeze my hand under the table once I sat back down. I don't tell that story to make my aunt sound cruel. I don't think she was. I think she genuinely believed structure and consequence were the same thing, that a 16-year-old collapsing was a price worth paying if it taught the other 299 of us something about respecting authority. I just couldn't find my way to agreeing with her, not after watching Tyler's hands shake at his own locker for 3 straight days. Families picked sides that fall in a way that outlasted the actual conflict, and some of those lines are still there, quietly, at school board meetings 2 years later. I found myself, more than once that winter, thinking about the freshman Blade had paid off, Devin Carr, the $38 lunch debt, the story that used to be the nicest thing anyone said about her. I never figured out how to fully reconcile that person with the one who chained a door on 300 kids to protect her own contract. Maybe both of those women were real. Maybe caring about fairness and needing to control every version of the story other people told about you can start in the same place and end up somewhere completely different, depending on what gets threatened along the way. I mourned that, a little, in a way I didn't expect to. Not her job, not her reputation, just the fact that whatever decent instinct made her quietly pay a stranger's lunch account never got the chance to win out over the part of her that needed to be seen as right, no matter the cost to the kids in front of her. The board's investigation concluded in February. Blade wasn't fired outright. The district's attorneys advised against the exposure of a wrongful termination claim, given how carefully she'd worded every email and instruction to leave herself technically covered on paper. I read the board's closed session summary months later, after it became part of the public record through an open records request Elena Reyes filed on Harper's behalf, more out of principle than any real expectation it would change the outcome. The summary noted, in the flat language these documents always use, that Blade had demonstrated a pattern of prioritizing institutional image over documented health and safety obligations. Language that felt, reading it at my own kitchen table almost a year later, both completely accurate and strangely inadequate for what it actually described. Instead, she was reassigned to a district office curriculum position, a desk job with no students, no building of her own, no intercom to speak through. Her name still shows up on state directories somewhere in Millbrook Unified. I've never run into her since, and I don't especially want to. By spring, Ridgefield had a new cafeteria oversight committee, written permanently into district policy, with 2 rotating seats reserved for students and 1 for a parent. I served on it my senior year. Harper served the semester before me. It's not a glamorous job, budget line items, vendor contracts, the occasional argument about pizza day frequency, but every meeting starts with someone reading the health inspection log out loud, in public, on the record, because that's the rule now, and it's the rule because of what it cost to learn we needed it. Tyler manages his blood sugar the same way he always did. Careful, prepared, no different than before. Except now there's a written policy behind him instead of just a laminated card in his backpack. He still keeps granola bars in his jacket sleeve out of habit. I don't think that habit ever fully goes away, not after a week like that one. Harper and I still talk most days, though the easy certainty she used to carry into every conversation about rules and fairness never fully came back the way it was before. She's studying pre-law now, out of state, and she told me once over a phone call that she picked it specifically because of that October. Not because the system had worked, but because she wanted to be in the room next time it didn't, with better tools than a folded handbook and a strategic lunch delivery. I think about Grace Delgado sometimes too, though we were never especially close before or after. We graduated the same June, and the last time I saw her at a graduation party that summer, she told me she still couldn't walk past a chemistry classroom without thinking about the sound the floor made. I understood that more than I wanted to. Some sounds just stay with you. My mom got a small commendation from the superintendent's office the following spring, a plaque that sits in our hallway closet more often than it hangs on any wall, because she says she never did it for a plaque. She did it because a district record showed something that didn't add up, and she happened to be the person positioned to notice. I think about that chain on the cafeteria door sometimes, the actual physical weight of it, wrapped twice through the handles like it was built to hold something much bigger than a room full of lunch tables. It wasn't really holding food back from us that week, it was holding a truth back from all of us, buying 2 weeks of silence at the cost of kids fainting in classrooms and on kitchen floors, so one adult's version of events lives could survive long enough to matter more than 300 kids' actual lunches. The doors don't lock like that anymore, not for reasons like that one anyway. I graduated that June, and on my last walk past the cafeteria, I noticed the door propped wide open with a rubber stop, sunlight cutting across the floor tiles, no chain in sight. It's a small thing. It shouldn't have taken what it took to get there, but I stood in that doorway a minute longer than I needed to, thinking about Grace on the chemistry floor, and Tyler on his kitchen floor, and Harper's face losing all its color in the gym bleachers, and I understood, finally, the actual lesson buried underneath all of Blade's talk about character and respect. It was never really about the tray. It was never really about us. It was about what one person will let happen to 300 kids before they'll admit they made a mistake, and how much it takes. A lawsuit, a locked-out grandmother with a breadstick station, a facilities worker's Saturday afternoon phone call, a cook finally willing to lose her comfort to tell the truth, to make that cost too high to hide behind a padlock ever again.